Hi everyone. I hope we've got a really interesting debate here. It's become this weird reality. As a year ago, if we'd asked about franchise systems within esports, you'd have had very little to refer to. And of course, the world has changed. It's in the process of changing dramatically, and we've got two excellent speakers and debaters to run through the merits and pros and cons of this for you. And I will warn you up front, I'm going to take a vote at the end. I've made this viciously competitive to make it more interesting and
toxic, you mean?
Toxic. That's in line with Call of Duty culture.
Doesn't quite understand the incentive structures in play here. But
well, I'm sure most of you know that I'm going to make the intros. Firstly, on my left in the blue corner, Michal, who is an ESL veteran, as you know, but VP Pro Gaming to give him his formal title, but really, best known in the esports world for the guy behind the IEM, the Intel Extreme Masters Series, and the guy on stage in front of the massive crowds in Katowice. It's a hell of an experience, and he's a guy worshipped in Poland by the youth of Katowice. It's a weird thing to see.
That's an outsider's perspective, but I'll take it. He's probably contributing a nice chunk of the Katowice GDP at this point.
Definitely true.
I imagine there's like an annual giving the city keys to Michal process every year.
That has to be the case. I mean, it's the only event I've ever been to where you can see people queuing at 5 o'clock in the morning in March in Katowice. This year about -26. I think quite something to see. And on the other side, Tomi Kovanen, who is the GM of, or his business development actually at...
GM of CSGO and VP of business development.
Yeah, it's really, I've had this debate and got all confused about it, but I hope most of you know that Immortals run an amazingly successful CSGO team under the MIBR brand, which is the historically in the last 2 years, one of the most successful CSGO teams in Tier 1, fantastic group of guys. But not only does he have a wealth of media experience and esports experience, but what is pretty rare in the esports world in my last 3 years of experience is that he has good experience outside the esports bubble. With time at JP Morgan, and I think that perspective should help. It's pretty rare in the esports world for somebody to have that kind of outside perspective. So I think we've got a lot to gain there. I'm going to start off with something really basic, and that is to ask each of them, in their own words briefly, to explain the difference between a franchise system and an open system. And I'm going to let Michal kick off. I'll pull this out, so don't panic. But if you tell us what you think the difference is, and I'll correct both of you.
I think that what we say franchise in esports is probably not the correct use of the term every single time. But it essentially implies when in esports somebody says franchise system, it implies that somebody has a golden ticket to forever be in the league. Now, how it manifests itself across sports, in Europe, I'm not aware of any franchise system in Europe. In Europe, it's open. The three of us can start a football club, and 10 years from now, the football club can be in the Premier League, potentially. Whereas no such thing is possible in US sports, where they pick cities based on whether it's a good market, whether they can make money there. They install 1 or 2 teams there that play in the league. If the market's big enough, they'll install 2 teams rather than go to another city. Essentially, I find the franchise idea extremely business-centric, business first, entertainment second, sports third, whereas in Europe it's sports first, entertainment second, business third. It seems like the kind of priority order difference. That's the main thing, I'd say.
Tomi?
So I think you did a pretty good job of explaining the differences, but then you had the subjective thing at the end. I would actually argue that it works the other way. So I don't think the way it the flow goes is that you start from something and you head over to something. I think the reason that the franchise model in the US is superior is that because you start from the business side of things, that's what allows you to have enough resources flowing through the other parts, which I think lead to better entertainment, a better product for fans, and also better sports. I mean, I don't think it's by accident that some of the biggest sports leagues are in the US. It's that because, first of all, the market is big. It's not as fragmented as the European market, but also because of the franchise system, the financials, the math really just works out better, which is how you can actually put out a better product on the floor.
Thanks. Tomi, just before you go on, let's narrow it down to an esports context, because let's talk about the real examples that we've got, the Overwatch League and the LCS to some extent, versus potentially something like ESL Pro League, for example, or ECS. Tell us how the two big franchises operations that we know about, Overwatch and League of Legends, how do they work?
Also, the big difference between them is that LCS has relegation, right? It's like that's the main thing, which is what Michal was saying. It basically functions as European sports leagues, where if you're just really bad and you keep placing last, you could be relegated out of it, the same way that EPL, ESL Pro League works, where the worst teams will have to go through relegation at the end of every season, and then the upcoming teams from the lower divisions will have a chance to actually make it and get into the top tier division. Whereas then Overwatch League, which is really the most American sports league out of all the esports leagues, functions exactly like the big traditional sports leagues in the US, where effectively the teams that own a spot, including our team, the Los Angeles Valiant spot in the Overwatch League, we basically have that spot for life, essentially. So it's ours, and it doesn't matter how poorly we might do competitively, it's still ours, and we'll have a chance to improve on the roster, field a better team every season, and there's no risk of relegation, which I think the positive side of that is it allows us to invest much more in making sure that works out. I think the big problem with LCS relative to all, I think, can be that
LCS, by the way, in North America is franchised, and it's going to be franchised in Europe.
Yeah, but for the time being. I think the big difference is that it can be harder to justify making big investments, particularly if you're thinking about infrastructure type investments, i.e., like training areas. You try to set up offices for the teams, things like that you actually have to front money for. I think it can be harder if you don't know whether there's going to be a team that you're going to have 2 years down the road. So I think it just creates a lot of uncertainty, and I think knowing that you have that spot and it's not going to be taken away from you, I think it's going to allow you to invest more, and it's going to create a more of a competitive situation among all the teams that are in the league, and I think that's going to end up with better competition and as such better product for the viewers.
I think obviously one of the ways in which, and in fact the principal ways in which existing American traditional sports leagues maintain competitive integrity and a level playing field, to use that term, is that they have player wage cap and they have a draft system. So from the college system up into the pros. How does the Overwatch League ensure that you guys, for example, don't bump along the bottom forever? If that were to happen, how do they make sure that there isn't a Barcelona or Real Madrid just winning, or Celtic winning the league year after year after year and make it boring?
Well, so the way I think about anything in life really is through incentives. I think that's the best way to sort of model behavior across anything, and I think the best way to ensure that any of these leagues or anything else really works out in the best way possible is to create incentive structures that effectively make everybody want to be better. So if you have an incentive structure where you're going to get more home games from 2020 onwards, which is where you're going to sell all the tickets, which is where you're going to make all the money, as it currently works in the NBA, for example, I think that's always going to incentivize you to try to be better. As similarly, if you're just the bottom feeders year in, year out, you're never getting better, it's certainly going to impact your fan base, and I think that's going to obviously flow down to your revenues. And I think effectively you just want to create incentive structures that make all the teams want to improve. Obviously, there can be issues depending on how all the financials work and everything. I think certainly having the home games from 2020 onwards is something that's going to have a huge positive impact on that. it's yet to be seen how exactly the financials will end up working out for Overwatch League, because the home game structure has never been used in esports before. But if we think about the NBA, just the amount of games that are played in the playoffs every year have a big impact on the upcoming year's salary cap, because it's based on the league's previous year's revenue. And the impact for teams, say Golden State in the last couple of years, because they've just rolled through the league for 3 out of 4 years now in a row. Even though obviously lots of lopsided series, so not as many games as it might have been otherwise. It's tens of millions a year. So I think there's a huge financial incentive in you fielding a competitive team and getting as many home games as possible.
Okay. That makes sense. Michal, let's explain the open league structure a little bit in the same way we've described the franchise system in the Overwatch League. Let's take ESL Pro League as an example, and what you see as the incentive, and I hope it's pretty obvious in most cases, to field a competitive team.
So I think overall, so for the record, actually my let's call it ideal format for esports is much closer to the ATP or PGL than it is to any league. I'm not a fan of leagues in principle. And to answer why, you have to look at, leagues in sports in general have been created. If you're copying something, you take the NBA and you copy it over to esports or whatever, you have to ask yourself, why did the people that created this create it like that in the time and the circumstances that they had? The answer is always money and being able to monetize. When the leagues were created, the youngest of the major leagues that we know in the NBA was in 1946. All the leagues younger than 1946, including the Football League in England and whatever, the structures that they employ today are a direct derivative of the monetization model that they had back almost 100 years ago, which is the stadium. So they created leagues in order to multiply the number of games played as much as possible, because they were not able to monetize television, and nationally, globally, they didn't have Facebook, they didn't have Twitter, they didn't have live streaming, internet, cheap flights, satellite television, global brands, or anything like that. So it stands to reason that they would build systems where they multiply the number of times they derive revenue. But today, if we look at new sports properties, none of them actually work around multiplying the physical event as much as possible, but rather everything is built around monetizing a global media property globally as much as possible. So here's that. Don't really like the league in general. And as a TV product, it creates something really, really boring in comparison. So is it interesting to watch regular season games in the NBA where the Philadelphia 76ers are actually incentivized, to use Tomi's point, to suck so they get a better draft pick later?
Trust the process.
So where there's practically nothing on the line for them actually throughout most of the season, where the product is, if Tommy's a fan of the Golden State Warriors, and it's the middle of October, does the Golden State Warriors regular season game, where we kind of know they're going to make the playoffs anyway, does it win every single time as an entertainment product? Does that middle of the season game win every single time with something else? It doesn't. Just like, if I'm a Liverpool fan and they're playing Spurs in the middle of October, and my wife decides to buy a bottle of wine and invite me for a nice date or something like that, in the middle of October, it's actually a bit of a fight there. In April, May, when every point is really deciding things, it's not. It's interesting. But if it's last night's game versus Paris Saint-Germain in the Champions League, where Liverpool every step of the way can get knocked out, that's much more interesting and then my wife unfortunately has to pick another day to propose a date. So ultimately what franchise leagues do is create a lot of occasions where as an entertainment product that's being broadcasted, that's not a must-see, unfortunately, a lot of the time, because originally it was built around having a big crowd in the stadium and make money through that. But there's a ton of content there that's actually not that compelling or doesn't really glue you to the screen.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, look, obviously anybody examining the Overwatch viewing figures during the middle part of the league would concur with that. So I guess we'll get down to what might work better in the course of this debate. But I want to kind of narrow this down to the various stakeholder interests here, because clearly, ultimately we're trying to create something that works best for everybody. But in the world of esports, as we know, there are certain people that are more equal than others in terms of their stakeholder involvement. And the most equal partner in all of this is the publisher, the game developer, because they own the game. And this is clearly what makes us unique as an industry and very, very difficult. So I'm going to do it stakeholder by stakeholder. We'll start with you, Tomi. So first of all, the perspective on this. From each of these stakeholder groups, franchise or open system, the publisher. What works and doesn't work for them in this scenario?
So the funny thing is, I'm not sure if there is a definitive answer on what's best for the publisher. I think quite a bit depends on the company. If we look at who's out there currently, we see Valve, they're very much a laissez-faire approach. They really don't have a hands-on approach that relates to anything. And from everything I know about Valve, it doesn't seem like a company that would be very happy running a very structural franchise league. I think, if anything, they would hire someone like Michal over here to run that league for them and just take a cut of the revenue off the top. I think that would be their ideal way of running it. Then if we look at some other publishers, think about Blizzard, for instance, they're much more so the Apple of this comparison. They want to have their closed product. They don't want to let anybody else interfere. They want to make sure they have control over all the different parts of, the quality is consistent, whatever the case may be. Whereas with Valve, there's a lot of tournaments currently taking place. Obviously, ESL is hosting some of the best tournaments, but there's also quite a lot of variance in the quality because basically anybody who can just secure the funding can host tournaments. That's why some of the more sort of memorable, events in the bad sense of the word have been for CS. I think for franchising, I think certainly it would be helpful if I'm a publisher. Let's put my publisher hat on for a second. I think it would be helpful for me to have someone that I can actually fully rely on and trust running that for me. I think that's a lot less to take on internally. I think if you think about how many people Blizzard must be employing to run all of Overwatch League, it's got to be a massive effort internally for them. But at the same time, they're also getting a lot more out of it in the sense that they do have control. They know how the finals are going to look like. They know what the product is going to be day in and day out. Whereas for someone like Valve, I mean, they also pick out who's hosting which major, but it's still very limited. It's out of their hands in terms of what may or may not happen. So I don't think for a publisher there's necessarily a definitive answer. I think it just depends on what the company's philosophy is, essentially.
I disagree. I disagree because I personally see ultimately it doesn't really matter what the structure for the esports ecosystem for a given game looks like, as long as that game keeps producing new players, new top players. So if you have David Beckham retiring, if there's nobody else to be the next captain, to be the next superstar, if you have Leo Messi retiring and there's no one else coming on being a global superstar for football, that's obviously very bad for football, and that's how it's been in esports for years actually, because most esports ecosystems were not able to replace the waning or the retired superstars with players who are actually of higher quality. So in my opinion, the publisher should always strive to create an ecosystem which has the best chance of delivering better players year after year and replacing Tomi Quit. There's Tomi ideally doesn't quit of his own choice, but there's a young 17-year-old Finnish guy that is
still waiting for that kid, by the way. I'm sure there's someone playing at home currently, and maybe we'll have a really good Finnish Counter-Strike player one day.
I knew you'd say something arrogant. Anyway, there needs to be an ecosystem where there's a young kid that ousts the current, let's say, superstar in that superstar's prime, and that's interesting. That's what ultimately, that's what sports is all about. And I think creating a franchise league, or a limited league, let's call it, creates a very set, very limited number of jobs that exist in that ecosystem. And a fixed number of jobs doesn't actually create growth if it's fixed. And I, as a publisher, would like to create as many jobs for pro gamers as possible. As many people being able to derive value out of the ecosystem as players, that will create a greater number of, a broader base of players to choose from. But also, the more of those players being good and kind of talking to each other by competing with each other, the quicker they will push each other to become better players. And you will produce better players as opposed to a closed ecosystem where there is a group of, I don't know, let's call it 10 teams in the league, and they all practice with each other, and they're all full-time, they all are millionaires, and the highest salary outside of the league is maybe $1,000 a month. And that is not going to produce people outside of the league that will replace the people in the league. And that, to me, is the core problem with a closed ecosystem.
So let me just jump in here real quick. I don't think it necessarily is a problem with the ecosystem. I think it's the way traditional sports work. So I think the big difference between esports and traditional sports in general is that because of physical limitations in traditional sports, everybody kind of gets good enough around the same age. You can't really be 10 and be a world-class player in basically any sport. You kind of have to be of a certain age, which is why the whole system of in Europe going through clubs or in the US going through the high school and college system works as the funneling players to the top. I think the difference for esports is that because it's not of a certain age, I don't think you're as restricted in developing players the same way. So I think because the players develop around the same age, you're not really going to find a 28-year-old basketball player who didn't play previously who's going to turn into a really good NBA player. You don't actually have to worry about what's outside the best leagues by the time you're 28, because it's sort of irrelevant for the grand scale of things. I think on the other hand, for esports, that's exactly why the league needs to be, an imaginary league, and that would have to be structured in a separate way where you ensure that enough money is being funneled outside of the league. I think that's one of the things that, obviously hasn't been cracked yet, I think, in esports, but I think you have to make sure that you have enough money coming from the top league, which I think is going to do a better job than anything we have currently at, acquiring marketing dollars from the whole ecosystem because they effectively control it. But I think a big part of that will have to be a revenue share down to the lower levels to make sure that there are other things happening outside of it. And I think that's the fundamental difference between esports and traditional sports.
And I think if we look at esports earnings, and granted that's not a perfect source by any stretch of imagination, in Counter-Strike, which is an open ecosystem, there are 4.7 thousand players that won prize money in 2017. In League of Legends, a game that's 12 times bigger, if we talk about the monthly player base, there's 1.7 thousand players that won prize money. So if we talk about imaginary leagues, that's fine, but today, in the esports landscape that we know today, CSGO is providing much more incentive to players all around the world globally to spend time and invest time and compete compared to any closed ecosystem known to me.
Interesting.
I just want to interject and mention that interesting 180, Tomi, because I have a tweet from you from 1.5 years ago where you called franchise leagues a money grab for the teams, and now that you work for a team, you love it.
Listen. I'll jump in just to say that while it is better financially, which I've never argued against. I still think it's better financially. I think it doesn't take anything away from any of the arguments that I've made.
Let's move it on to the players, because I think this is a little devil's advocate moment for me here. One of the big differences, I'm game neutral, outsider in this, I'm just the match fixing guy. I look at all of this from above like God. And I say, I meet all these players, and the guys in Counter-Strike, for example, the players are the product, right? And this is true of any sport. Players are the product. But what you see is, as you guys know, the fans follow the players. And so there are team brands that are incredibly important and growing. But if, let's take Gabriel Toledo, Fallen leaves MIBR and he moves to some other team.
It's not leaving MIBR.
I'm using an example. Right? One of the best players in the world. A huge chunk of fans are moving with him. We know that. Now, those sort of identities have not emerged to that extent in Overwatch and to some extent in League of Legends, but that's been around in a different format. But in Overwatch, the teams are obviously benefiting because it's their brand that is prominent. In a sense, they are the product. The players are not secondary, but you understand the difference. So I'm going to ask, in terms of franchise versus open system, as a player, which one do you prefer?
If I was a player?
Yeah, speak from a player's perspective.
Well, I think that franchising definitely has an extremely top-heavy money distribution. So it creates millionaires out of the top players. It makes the top players millionaires and LCS players. It's not unheard of for a player to have $1 million salary, or maybe even above. So it's a complex question, because if I'm a top player, I definitely prefer to be in a franchise because that puts more money in my pocket. If I'm an aspiring player, I'm actually not thinking about becoming the number one necessarily, but becoming better and good enough to be somewhere there and potentially make that next step. So I think for top players, franchising obviously the greatest thing because it's more money. For a larger number of aspiring players, an open system is probably more desirable, I would say.
I'll throw this in. In a franchise system where the owner of the league, of the franchise, not necessarily of the franchise, but of the league, the structure, can impose certain conditions in terms of wage cap distribution, prize money, ability to earn outside with personal sponsors, streaming, and all of this stuff, could be that as a top player you actually earn less than a top player in a Counter-Strike or open system where you've got all these other avenues. You've got much more freedom to trade. As a top Counter-Strike player, you can move teams, you can determine your value.
It's true, but I think there's so many variables. But if I'm a top player, again, if there is a franchise league that's non-restrictive to players' personal rights and you can monetize your own brand quite freely, I prefer a franchise league if I'm a top player because that's guaranteed money. Also, if I'm a smart, handsome, do very well in interviews, it's quite likely that I will remain a player and the team will choose to monetize me rather than kick me out and get risk getting a younger, hungrier player in for potentially a 1 notch higher, 2 notches higher result, which is, by the way, another problem with franchise leagues, that if you have a closed league and you have a very famous player that's easily monetizable, you might not have the incentive to actually remove him because you're guaranteed to make money with him in the league.
So you actually made part of my argument now, which is a real shame, which is that if you think about some of the American leagues that actually have hard caps, so you think about NBA, think about LeBron, Steph Curry, some of the most popular players, they're heavily underpaid because of the franchise system. It's like you said, the leagues actually impose clear rules on how you can divvy up the salaries. And I think even if you think about the open circuit, so let's think about Counter-Strike, actually, I don't think it's nearly as black and white as Michal pointed the picture. Because if we think about Counter-Strike, we think about the top 3 teams. Those guys are all millionaires. They're already millionaires now for the players that have been around for a couple of years. But if you think about the top 12 team, whoever that might be, depending on where they're from, they're probably, just about having an average salary in the Western world.
There are 10 teams in Poland where players are making a full-time salary. In Poland.
Yes, but again, I think in countries of higher cost of living, it's going to be way fewer. But you get my point. The point is that I actually think it's more unevenly distributed in the open circuit. Now, I think the good thing about the open circuit format is that you sort of have a clear path, I think, towards getting paid. Because you could theoretically just play in one of the ESL's open qualifiers for whatever the next tournament is going to be. And if you do well enough, you might go to that tournament, then you get picked up and you start getting paid a salary. So the path is clear. But I actually think that it still comes down to the same thing, where it's going to be very few teams who are making a very comfortable living, making lots of money, and then, or maybe even very few players, depending on the game or the sport, on how the salary is divided among the team. And I think in a franchise system, you get, again, it's the one drawback that I will say that exists is that you are a limited number of teams. So let's say 30 teams. Let's say even if you added 2 backup players, you only have 210 players. And outside of that, then it just comes down to how much money flows outside of the franchise system to the lower levels. And I think, again, that's the key thing that needs to be solved, I think, for those leagues in esports. But I think that actually is probably better for most players, just because even though your ascent to the top won't be as fast, because there will be open qualifiers every month, I think you know what you're getting, and it's a lot easier to sort of justify going for that. In a franchise league, you're never going to have these situations that we had with Denial, I think most recent example that was tweeted about, where players are owned, like tens of thousands in salaries. They were never reimbursed for flights that they bought themselves because they actually thought that some sucker would pay them back like they promised. And I think that's a real problem, and that's the kind of control that you can impose in a franchise league, just outside of how the money is distributed, and you have quality control, so you won't run into these issues. And again, I think the distribution of money is equally skewed towards the very top in the open circuit.
I think in terms of quality control, you can definitely install mechanisms in both the franchise league and the open ecosystem. It just depends how involved you want to be. If you want to be completely hands-off, no quality control, you can be. It's not a 0-1.
No, of course, but I think on a relative basis, it's easier to have more control than a franchise league.
Right, let's move. I'll leave some time for questions and sort of 5 minutes at the end, but there's a really important constituency here, which we've covered peripherally, but I'd like to focus on for a minute, is the fans. What's best for the fans? Bearing in mind what I already said, and I think we conceded about the fans being fans of, in certain games, the players, and in other games, fans of the team. And all the grey in between, because of course there is both. But Michal, the fans, what works best for them?
To me, what works best for them is an open ecosystem, because it generates more interesting personalities, more interesting stories. I mean, we've seen at the International in Vancouver now, a couple of weeks ago, we had the team OG, who was not rated, didn't even exist technically as a lineup, and they won the International. We had ESI London Cologne, we had the team Big, very low ranked team overall, got in only by virtue of being the highest ranked home team, German team, to represent the crowd, and they got to the grand final. I like a system where there are no gatekeepers for talent. I like a system where you can have, Leicester City winning the Premier League and drawing headlines and making it exciting for the entire world to follow. I like that. I like when there's a genuine chance for somebody to come in and make a mark. I also think that fans sometimes can be completely hard done by, because the commissioner of the league or whoever else decides that says, you know what, Oakland is going to move to Las Vegas. Screw you, people that visited the stadium for decades. Now it's businesses running in Las Vegas. And that's obviously unheard of and actually shocking for European ears to happen. And organic growth just doesn't exist, and organic growth can create stories that we have never imagined. to exist. So to me, that's hands down more exciting and more interesting.
Can we just appreciate for a couple of seconds the fact that this guy right here just moved his tournament from Oakland to another city this year for a just give it a good 2 seconds, just to because the moves do happen in the open circuit too. It turns out.
But what do you do? What do you do with fan base with the decades of a fan was visiting that stadium for since he was 10 years old. Now he's 25 and suddenly no Oakland Raiders anymore. That's again completely insane for a European. Even if a club, let's say Leeds United, goes bankrupt, that club can actually go back, and they are now in Championship division, going from being in administration back to rebuilding themselves based on that fan base, the tradition, the roots that they have put down. Whereas it's completely normal and possible and doable to just rip everything out with its roots and yank it in somewhere else in another market because you make more money this way. I have a hard time accepting that idea.
Yeah, I do have to give awesome kudos for the sucker punch. It was excellent. Because Oakland was only there for 2 years, so that with that.
Professional sports franchises don't move often. I mean, this isn't something that happens every year. Like there's a new city that bids for whatever team to build a nicer stadium with more public grants, and then the team moves. Like this is a rare occasion. I think one thing that people heavily overlook with the open circuit is that it's very hard to follow everything. And this is something that many of my friends who I used to play Counter-Strike with, 10, 15 years ago, who don't have time to play, don't have time to follow. But like every now and then, once a month they'll log on the website, see what games are on, and they still enjoy watching it. And what they always tell me is that they have no idea, like who's the good team if they haven't paid attention for 2 months. Like they have no idea what's going on, what the tournaments are that matter, who the teams are that are good, like what's happening, because there's just too much. And I think the unpredictability is actually
You're talking about a specific application in Counter-Strike, which can be quite easily fixed.
Yeah, whether or not it will be fixed is a whole different issue. Guys, I want to ask questions, or allow time for questions. It's a point, well made, and this is part of the problem in Counter-Strike specifically, as in certain other games, is that there's no good narrative. There's nothing that links the Counter-Strike scene particularly well. But that's not necessarily a problem with the open system, because there's a lack of a narrative in certain closed leagues as well, without naming any of them. But I want a minute or two for questions. We have skipped over, as I'm sure many of you will notice, your own stakeholder group, in particular the broadcasters and sponsors in this debate, in terms of who wins from these systems. And I did also want to cover whether geography makes a difference, because obviously we've got a massive difference between a kind of basic North American model of how sports runs and a European model. But it's more important that we hear from you guys if you've got anything to say before we vote. Have we got any questions?
At the moment, we're taking questions on the app, which the information is up there on the top right over there, app.slide.go. If you want to ask any questions, then go on there and type your question in, and then we'll be able to read it out to the moderator. So the first question that we've got here is, what is the incentive for an existing organisation to join a franchise league when they can't use any of their previously gotten brand awareness?
So I think I'll take that one off the top. So actually, I don't think that's an issue at all, and I'll elaborate in a second. Part of it, for example, our Counter-Strike team, the company's name is Immortals. That's the main brand of the company that I work for. But the Counter-Strike team is actually under the name of MIBR. And then we have, obviously, the Overwatch League team, which is playing under Los Angeles Valiant. And I think actually it makes sense to have more than one brand, because we think that the brands are very important for the fans. So if you have only one brand, in the way esports organizations currently work, you'll probably have anywhere from 2 to 5 games representing or playing for your organization, which means that you have 5 distinctive teams with even more players, and you're trying to build one cohesive brand that sort of works for everybody. But I feel like what you end up with is a watered down version that's like pretty much right there with the average, and you can't really ever build a brand that really fits the team, really fits the fan base, really fits whatever you want. So if you think about our organization, MIB has really thought of, as the flagship team of Brazil. They've always had lots of competitive success. That's the kind of brand. And then Los Angeles Valiant is more so, it's very inclusive. That's the biggest thing I think that brand is known for. It's the LA team, so it's an entirely different vibe. But I think because the brand is so important to the fans, it actually makes sense to have a couple. I don't think it dilutes it in any way for the organization. I think in some ways you might actually be better off, even in terms of sales, regardless of what actually happens to the brand, because you now have two different brands that you can sell everything for. So you have the same inventory, and in some ways you can kind of double up on some of it.
That makes sense. I have an interesting question here. I'm not going to say who it's from, but it's a wild accusation often thrown at, quite rightly in my view, at esports generally, but specific to these games. What's the incentive for an existing organisation to join a franchise league where they can't monetize any of their the app jumps around. I've just asked. That's not fair. I had a great question here.
Technology.
Here we go. How do we know the Overwatch League can last as much as, say, League of Legends? What if Overwatch dies and now your franchise team is just useless?
I think it's a risk that you obviously weigh when you're thinking about buying into any league. I think you have to think about the esports long-term value prop, whether you think it can be around. What I will say is I think it's a lot easier to invest an equal amount of money in a game that is being run in a franchise league that is highly controlled. You have a lot of things planned around it than it is in the open circuit. With that being said, the buy-ins for franchise leagues tend to be significantly higher than what it would cost for you to hire, if, for example, for what we pay, what the running costs of MIB are, we pay more on a run rate basis for the team, but the buyout would have been less than what we paid for Overwatch.
So when you're involved in a multi-game org like Immortals, do you have more control or cooperation with Blizzard on the Overwatch League to balance changes, meta changes, changes in the game than you would have, for example, with Valve and Counter-Strike, where I assume you have absolutely no influence at all?
Well,
Is that helpful?
So I generally don't deal with Blizzard on things, so I can't really talk about the game balancing, but I don't think any franchise should have say on how the game is balanced during the season. I think if anything, you would only think about that in the off season. I think something like that happened over the summer, which heavily changed how the playoffs potentially played out in the end for Overwatch League this year. I don't think it's so much about balancing the game. I actually think the long-term solution should be that all these changes are made outside of the season, so you don't run into some of the issues that we have. But I think the control outside of the game itself, i.e. the product that is being sold to the fans, I think is the valuable portion of it.
One of the things, Michal, this arising out of a question here from another anonymous person, which is fine. Tomi mentioned the benefit of franchising that the devs, or the publisher, could regulate their league, but why can't you do that with an open circuit like Dota 2?
You absolutely can. I mean, any publisher can have any level of control from 0% to 100% over whatever they're doing. There's no reason. Currently, Valve for Counter-Strike is probably investing around $2 million of their own money per year to achieve esports broadcasting minutes that compare to League of Legends. They're behind because the game is smaller, but they compare to League of Legends at a cost of 1% of what League of Legends is paying to obtain their esports minutes. So it's fairly clear who's...
We know Valve has the best business here. I don't think anybody's arguing against that.
I mean,
Valve, but there are other stakeholders, Michal. We're trying to make esports sustainable, not Valve's bottom line.
And I still think that a thriving game of the same number of people playing will create more jobs and a bigger economy overall if it's open. It's simple, it scales quicker, it allows more people to invest, it allows more people to do something, and it's just a simple thing of if you put 100 people on solving a problem, it's better than if you put 10 people to solve a problem. But to answer,
yeah, too many cooks and all of that.
but
But
to,
I get the
to
point.
answer the question,
Yeah.
any publisher can have anything between 0 and 100% control over what they do, and Valve could stipulate very, very stringent, rigid standards to which the majors should run, and they could definitely even dictate, as to the color of the shoes of the referee, to any level of detail if they choose to. So regulation isn't really a thing that will only be exclusive to franchise leagues.
Well,
I have 2-second comment
yeah,
on
2
that.
seconds.
The Valve majors are 2 events in a year out of maybe 50 pretty big. And
Again, it could be
events.
more. You can
So-
scale the number as much as you like.
Yes, you can, but then it takes significantly more resources, which is, again, why you want to pool everything into one go.
Well, let's see if this has helped you guys reach a conclusion. So, I'm going to ask it this way. Those of you, by show of hands, who think that the open system is better than the franchise system, raise your hands. All right, for balance, let's see who thinks franchise is better. Interesting. Thanks very much, everyone.